all for being here on this beautiful May evening in Charlottesville at this most amazing venue and club. And I just particularly want to thank Punky and Melissa for organizing this, all those who have contributed to organizing this, and particularly to George Sanborn. Where is George? George, where are you? Oh, there you are. George gets half the credit for doing about half of my research on this topic. So I'll show you at those times where I was able to make use of that and then where I've gone beyond. But as I've said to some of you, this topic was completely inspired by Punky and Melissa and George. And they started to inspire me February a year ago when Farmington hosted the then Archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogun. And they were displaying these amazing photographs of Franklin Roosevelt here at Farmington. Otherwise, I had no idea that I had been working so close to the sacred ground on which FDR and Eleanor had walked in 1936. But with that, I want to tell you a little bit about my history with the name Farmington. I mentioned this to some of you February a year ago at my dinner table. And that is, on the right, you might say, well, that's not our Farmington, and that is correct. It is Louisville's Farmington. So as you were told, I was born and raised in Farmington, and this, along with the last home of George Rogers Clark, the founder of Louisville and the brother of William Clark, his last home was called Locust Grove in Louisville. That was his sister's estate. And Farmington was the estate of the Speed family. And Lincoln became good friends with the Speeds and would sometimes come down from Illinois and visit with them there. So you can imagine, as grade schoolers, we were taken on field trips to Farmington, the historic home in Louisville, and to Locust Grove. But let us move along to, where do I point? Where? Hannah. Let's give a hand for Hannah. She has done amazing things. Back here, we have the piano. Okay. So the Roosevelts, not only in our neighborhood, but this was also given to me as a subtitle, at UVA, Monticello, Farmington, and I had to add beyond, because they went beyond all of these places, and you'll see why I say that in a moment. But first of all, you know that we have two branches of the famous Roosevelt family. One, the Oyster Bay Roosevelt family, which is the Teddy Roosevelt clan. So there were two brothers from Holland who came to New Amsterdam, to what was called then, now Manhattan, and they split off into these two branches, and one settled in Oyster Bay and one settled in Hyde Park. Eleanor was from the Oyster Bay branch because her dad was the brother of Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, Theodore Roosevelt gave her away at her wedding to Franklin because her dad sadly had died of alcoholism before she was 10 years old, and her mother had passed as well. So by the age of 10, Eleanor was a very sad orphan. And then the Hyde Park Roosevelts, you know, are FDR, the Delanos, and that Roosevelt clan. So I wanted to point to the fact that we have, sorry, let me go racing back here, that the Theodore Roosevelt Oyster Bay clan also were in this area. How many of you know of Pine Knot? Yeah, so just up the hills here, you know, past Monticello, is Pine Knot, and this is about how it looks today. It's just a little cabin. And I discovered that Edith Roosevelt, the second wife of Theodore Roosevelt, purchased that for her and her family of the 5 children she had with Theodore Roosevelt. I say that was his second wife. His first sadly died not too long after giving birth to the famous, or sometimes infamous, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. So the 5 children, though, the younger children, would come down. She bought this in 1905. They would come down from the White House, and I found this amazing cartoon. You can see what Teddy Roosevelt looks like with his hat on. The teddy bear that he was famous for developing has got his suitcase, and it says TR on it. The sign on the tree says "To Pine Knot," and he's fleeing from the White House. And I can't quite make out what the bombs are that are coming in, but I suspect they are issues of the day and policies of the day that he was having to deal with. But I also discovered that he came through here. He came through Charlottesville and stopped at the university in, as this indicates, in 1903. And this appeared in the Daily Progress. And it says in the headline, President Roosevelt here, meaning Theodore Roosevelt, 1903, executive receives great reception from university students. And don't worry if you can't read all of these texts. I just got so excited when I would find these that I would load them onto my screen. But what he said was to the students how interesting it was to be here. He said, I'm looking out at the audience and I see one of the men who fought with me in Cuba. Remember, the Spanish-American War had just started and ended in 1898. So this is only a few years after his famous charge up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders. So he looks out and he points to the person by name and he says, and I understand he was on your football 11. And so that this fellow had played football here at the university. But what I love about it is how he reaches out to the students and says the following. What an interesting thing it must be to every American to come through this historic land. And Eleanor and Franklin will have the same views when they come here as well. Teddy says, as we passed by the vista in the woods, we saw the home of the Madisons, saw Montpelier. Your great university here is associated with the early presidents of our country, indeed. We are here on the land, now get this, so this is 1903, right? When did the Civil War end? 1865. We are here on the land fought over by those who wore the gray and those who wore the blue. And those men and their descendants now stand shoulder to shoulder as good citizens, interested in all that concerns the welfare of our common nation. How we need those words today, right? Yeah, almost makes you a little bit verklempt to hear that, but good for Teddy. So I discovered that Eleanor had come through this area before they came here in 1936. She had come in 1934. Eleanor loved to drive. And so you see her standing outside the south portico of the White House. Notice no Truman balcony, because this is prior to Truman's presidency. And she is proudly standing by her new Plymouth Roadster. And she is then in the Plymouth Roadster driving, and she drove through here. She came to the university, she came to Monticello, and she brought with her her dear friend and press secretary, Lorena Hickok. And I'm pretty certain that this picture on the left in the passenger seat is Lorena Hickok, but I can't find a photo of them here in Charlottesville at the University of Monticello. This is when they took a trip all the way from Washington up to Canada. So she drove all over the country. She would drive through the South during the presidency when there was a bounty on her head from the Ku Klux Klan. She would, you might be interested to know, carried a pistol. And she not only had been trained to use it to defend herself by her bodyguard when she was the First Lady of New York State, but she carried a New York license to possess that pistol. And so she would carry that with her when she traveled. This is a different car, and there will be those of you who will know probably what that car is. I can see it's got different vents on it, so I'm not sure what that one is. She looks a little bit older in that photograph. But the reason I made such a point about her going back and forth, and indeed she was going to stop in Orange on her way back with Ms. Hickok, and they ate at the Robert E. Lee Tea Room. So that's where they got their lunch on the way back to Washington. Now, in the meantime, also in 1934, I discover that Franklin Roosevelt comes through Charlottesville on his way to Roanoke. So this, again, quite a bit of text, but I will elaborate. So he gets in Washington, he gets in a 6-car train of the Norfolk and Western Railway. And it says the train pulls out of Washington's Union Station on the morning of October 9th, 1934, carrying President Roosevelt, Franklin, to Roanoke. He was coming to dedicate the Veterans Hospital, a new complex in Roanoke. And then it said along the way, the train did slow as it moved through. So have any of you taken the Northeast Regional? I do that all the time now. I'd much rather do that than try to drive on 66, right? So if you just start thinking about the stops, all right? So they go through Manassas, Calverton, Orange, and I underlined Charlottesville because of our topic tonight, and Sweetbriar Station. Yay! Any of us here, Sweetbriar? Please raise your hand. Holla, holla. I taught there for 21 years before coming to the Miller Center, and it was no longer, by the time I got there, it was no longer a stop for the train, but they took the station and the little house that was there, and they brought it on campus, and it's now part of the art department. But I had to just put that in. So it says, perfect weather produced large waving crowds, catching a glimpse of the president cheerfully waving from the observation car. So now let's think about how he got around in the world, and how he got around in the States, and how he got out and about and was able to see people and have them see him. And most presidents, particularly in the modern era of modern media, want to be seen. This sadly leads to the death of John Kennedy. He would not let, in Dallas that day, November 22nd, 1963, he would not let his Secret Service agents ride on the running boards because he said, I have to be seen. I have to see those people on the side of the road as we go through on the motorcade in Dallas. In the case of Roosevelt, he couldn't walk. So great for him to go through these towns and be waving to people out of the observation car. They could see him. This picture down on the left is when they arrive in Roanoke, and he is seated with, it says they are joined in Lynchburg by the Virginia Governor George Peary, Senator Harry F. Byrd, and 6th District Congressman Clifton Woodrum. They boarded to join the others in the president's entourage that included Senator Carter Glass, who was from Lynchburg. His sister, Meta Glass, was the president at one time of Sweetbriar, and I held the Carter Glass chair at Sweetbriar, so my colleagues would, they would tease me, oh, you sit in a glass chair. Yes, I did. And Admiral Cary Grayson and the postmaster, Jim Farley. So they all gathered together in Roanoke, and you can see here the president now waving to the crowds of Roanoke from the back of the train. That was pretty common for him. And then you see the car pulled right up because he never wanted to be shown in a wheelchair. He never wanted to be shown being carried anywhere. So we'll get to that as he comes to Farmington and how he gets around here. But that takes him then to Roanoke, and then from there, after he dedicated the new Veterans Complex, he went on to William and Mary and gave a speech there. Now, we get to the good part where he's getting closer and closer to Farmington. So, on July 3rd, 1936, and again, thank you, George, for finding these clippings for me. This is from the Daily Progress, which, if you can read the fine print above, was an afternoon paper. Remember those days when you'd get a morning newspaper and then oftentimes a wholly different paper in the afternoon. And they were coming to this area to dedicate the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, had produced what we now know as the Skyline Drive and the Shenandoah Valley, the Shenandoah National Park. So they were coming from Washington to do that, and the picture then above is a nice luncheon that they had out in the picnic area along the Skyline Drive, and then the lower picture is of the president speaking at this particular dedication. I just also wanted to know, way up on the left there of this Daily Progress, it says, democracy will be outstanding topic for discussion at Affairs Institute. So this is July 3rd, 1936, also happening in Charlottesville at the university, at a university institute, is a discussion of democracy. How things stay the same, right, the more they change. In addition to that, it says one of the topics they're going to be discussing is separation of church and state. And I just saw today that the U.S. Supreme Court split 4-4 on a very important church-state issue involving charter school in Oklahoma that was meant to be a charter school, a Catholic school. And because they split 4-4, because Amy Coney Barrett recused herself. It upholds the lower court decision which said that that kind of school, a charter public school, but being Catholic in its religious background, would violate the separation of church and state. So again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, I not only say that we got FDR, hold on now, we've got FDR here July 3rd, so that evening after they leave from the dedication, and they come, and yes, Punky was here, and she welcomed them, along with Mr. Divers, who was also here, and he welcomed them. The time travel involved in this is just beyond, and now I know why they wanted me to talk about this topic. This is, of course, February, a year ago, when I first got so excited about this topic. And we got to have a tour by Punky and Mr. Divers, took us up to the gallery, okay, to see the room where Franklin slept. And the person in that picture is the then Archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogun, who gave such a wonderful panel here for us. She spoke at the Miller Center that day. She was, I think, the 11th or 12th Archivist of the United States, the first woman. She was appointed by President Biden, and unfortunately was tossed out a few days or weeks after the January inauguration of our current president. On the left bottom is the room connected to Franklin's room, where I think we were told that that's where his attendant, of course he would, all presidents to this day have what they call body men, who do everything that they need in terms of carrying things or handing them a mint or telling them the name of the person they're going to meet, and getting them on the plane and off the plane, that sort of thing. But presidents also tended to have valets. So FDR would have needed not only that, but he would have needed somebody physically to be helping him. So out in the gallery then is that adjoining room. And then here's Mr. Jefferson telling Mr. Divers about his latest invention, the iPhone, and the television. I mean, Mr. Jefferson, I bow down to thee. So now, here we are. This is the photo that just so stunned me when I saw it February a year ago. And as I understand the story, one of your members discovered this on an auction site or an archive site and purchased it for the club. And bless you all, bless the Historical Society here for wanting to preserve this story. Because you can see then, we believe this was July 4th, the next day after the Roosevelts had arrived, that they are now getting ready to depart from the octagonal room on that porch with, notice, a ramp for the president. And then with him is typical when he is standing. And I'll point out some other examples as we continue to go on. But when he would stand, and he could, I'm going to put in inverted commas or quotes, walk. He could, because he was paralyzed from the waist down, he could sort of swing his hips from one side to the other, but he had to have a really strong person there so that because those braces were locked on his polio-inflicted legs, if he began to lose balance, he would just keel over. So the person who is there is Edwin, General Edwin, whose nickname from when he was at West Point was Pa, either P-A-W or P-A, Pa Watson, who was a military attaché and aide to the president, and what was then called secretary for appointments or appointment secretary. We would now probably say chief of staff. So he would be there holding up, if you will, Franklin Roosevelt, and then with a cane, so just to make it look like he just had a cane. That's all he needed. But look at how his hand, okay? His hand is around the general's arm. Also notice that while some of the people, in fact, I think the most distinguished is Mr. Peary. For want of an E-R-R-Y, he would be my relative, but he is P-E-E-R-Y. But how distinguished, and notice my dad would say this, no break. don't have any break in your trousers, you know, men who are properly turned out. Notice how the president's come down, his trouser legs come down over his shoes. That's to hide the braces. Again, not that people didn't know about this, but why remind them? So all of this is done by the club to make him feel like he is part of the regular people who can come here and go in and out freely. Along with, and again, thank you to George Sandberg for listing out all these people. In addition to the governor there, Carter Glass is immediately to the president's right. The members of his administration, the man in the far right holding the voter, I think is Mr. Farley, and there's also the Attorney General is there as well. And I remember having the discussion last January with George and Punky and Melissa at lunch here about why all these people, you know, why are all these people going with him? Well, if you are the governor of Virginia, a Democrat, if you are Carter Glass, a senator, a Democrat, if you are the Democratic congressman, and of course this is long before Virginia tends to go Republican, so it's a one-party state, then you're going to want to be there, right? When the president comes to your district or comes to your state, even if you're Carter Glass and you are uber conservative and you hate the New Deal and you really don't like Roosevelt that much either, and you're a solid segregationist, who, when he was challenged about the poll tax that was required of voters in Virginia, that this would hurt black voters especially and probably not allow them to vote, his response was, that's our point. That's what we're trying to do. So George was saying, but why would all these people come? Note 1936, July, what's going to happen that November? Re-election. All right? FDR doesn't know he's going to win in a landslide over Alf Landon. And remember, even though he won in a landslide in 1936 in the re-election campaign of November of that year, and he got 2/3 of the popular vote, that means 1/3 of the people didn't vote for him, and many of those people called him that man. They despised him so much they could not say his name out loud. Now, I love the fact that then, the next day, in her daily My Day column, so Eleanor Roosevelt did not start this as soon as she got to the White House, but fairly quickly, she began to write a daily column, My Day by Eleanor Roosevelt. And she would just report what she had done the previous day, and it would go into hundreds of newspapers all over the country. I mean, imagine how that was technically pretty good for the president, right? Because she could say what she did and what he did. So she says, as of July 4th, I was up early enough for a swim at the Farmington Country Club. And she says, we were delighted to find the sun shining, and if you all will look out the window, the lovely Blue Ridge Mountains looming up in the distance through a slight haze. At 9:15, we started for Monticello and found many of our party had never seen the house. That party would have been the group you saw on the front porch here. She said, no other's house is as interesting to me as this one because Thomas Jefferson had such a creative, versatile mind and expressed it in 1,000 little ways in the planning of this house, which I was, I'm sure, one of his chief diversions. She even said in the more fulsome column, I wanted to give the tour because she had been there, remember, 2 years before with Lorena Hickok. So Eleanor being Eleanor actually wanted to give the tour, but I don't think they let her do that. She says, I can never quite understand Jefferson's aversion to having a staircase anywhere in sight. He evidently thought they took up too much space and were not decorative. I wonder how anything was ever carried up those cramped little stairs in the wings at Monticello. Perhaps he was waiting till he found a staircase designed to satisfy his fastidious taste. I think she really does summarize Thomas Jefferson pretty well. But it just occurred to me as I was going back through this the other day, why do you think she was thinking about how to carry things upstairs? Because in the White House, the president would have to be carried up the stairs. They probably also had some, to this day, have some elevators as well. But in their townhome in Manhattan that had been built by her mother-in-law, the ever-meddling Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, had built 2 townhomes in Manhattan, one for her son and daughter-in-law in the early part of their marriage, and one for herself. And she built them right together. And she put doors between each of them with no locks. So she could just come over anytime and tell Eleanor she was doing something wrong, or she could spoil the grandchildren. All right, so Eleanor, I think, is thinking about how would they have ever carried Franklin up the stairs in Monticello. Here he is. Here is the president speaking for now what we know every July 4th is such an important time here in the city. And here, I was, thanks to the Sons of the American Revolution, I was asked on July 4th about 20 years ago to speak at the gravesite of Mr. Jefferson, which is really an amazing experience. I just couldn't even imagine how that would feel, but I felt his presence, and the topic I was assigned was church and state. And as I finished, I don't know whether this was good or bad, but a giant thunderstorm came up and lightning was, zigzagging all over the mountain. Think about what the president said. I can't find a video, but you can hear his words in audio. You can hear it on YouTube, you can hear it on the Monticello Foundation site. He says, "It is not beyond our power to relight the sacred fire of liberty that he believes that Jefferson did." He says, "There are no limitations upon the nation's capacity to obtain and maintain true freedom, no limitations except the strength of our nation's desire and determination." What's happening in Europe and the Far East in 1936? Japan is on the rise, right? The Empire of Japan is moving throughout Asia. Hitler comes to power 2 months before FDR takes the oath of office in 1933, and now it's 1936, so he's seeing what's going on there. So interesting to me that he accepted this invitation to come and speak at Monticello at this time. You see Paul Watson behind him because he got him to the podium. So whenever FDR got to a podium, you'll see him do this. If he gets to the podium and he's being introduced, as Punky introduced me, but I wasn't standing here because I could easily walk up once she said, "And now, Barbara Berry." If the president has to get up to the podium, he then stands like this to the side with his hand on the side of a really strong podium. And then he can kind of scoot around. I'll show you an example of that momentarily. You also see Eleanor there. So she's all dressed in white with her white summer shoes, which my mother always told me you cannot wear white, ladies, before Derby Day, which is the first Saturday in May in Louisville, and then you must stop at Labor Day. And my question was, Mother, what if you don't live in Louisville? How do women know when they can wear white shoes? And so you'll have to tell me if you're from somewhere. Memorial Day? Okay. Oh, we got 3 extra weeks, so the first Saturday in May. Okay. Well, Eleanor is fine and dandy. Well, I also couldn't help but say, guess what? FDR Jr. comes here the next year, and he is in the paper. First of all, what a handsome devil he was as a young man. Even as an older man. So from the Daily Progress, President's son at UVA today has interview with law school dean. Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. visited the University of Virginia Law School today discussing his courses that he would take as a law student. All right? He comes in 37 in the fall. You can find silent videos of him being followed around, but remember, we don't have the current law school, so he's in the law school over on main grounds. And he is being shown on the lawn, walking along the lawn, so this is for the media. And he has just married in 1937 another scion of an important, rich, wealthy Northeastern family, the DuPonts. So he marries Ethel DuPont, and they move to Charlottesville. And they live in a home that I have a picture of, but I don't know exactly where it is. So if anybody knows, please tell me afterwards. And then she has a riding accident, and I think it is in 1940 as he's getting close to graduation, but it says March, Charlottesville, 19. Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., the former Ethel DuPont, was injured today in a hunting spill while riding with the Farmington Hunt Club. which when I did my research on that, I discovered was south of town. But I don't know if it had, you'll have to tell me yes or no, did it have connections with this club? Now, some of you had already told me about Felicia Rogan. How many of you know Felicia? Wonderful, First Lady of Charlottesville. I got to know her through the Miller Center and the fact that she had done an interview with Rose Kennedy in the early 1970s that she then put in the library, then Alderman, now Shannon Library. And I was so excited doing my biography of Rose Kennedy. It's a great interview that Felicia did with Mrs. Kennedy, and it's one of the only times that Mrs. Kennedy remarks about the lobotomy that was done to her daughter Rosemary. And according to the interview transcript, Rose Kennedy said to Felicia, "I will never forgive my husband for doing that." The third wife of Franklin Jr., and I think second husband or third husband for Felicia was Franklin Roosevelt Jr. Now, I don't know if they did a lot at that point. I know Felicia was here once she married Mr. Rogan, and Ed was telling me about how wonderful that couple was in developing the wine industry here and bringing Charlottesville another reason to be famous. But also, what a handsome couple they were, I have to say. So, back to 38. While Franklin Jr. is in law school here, he and Ethel have their first baby, and he becomes Franklin Delano Roosevelt III. And Ethel, and here you see the little baby, FDR Jr. And FDR III, on one of my days, Eleanor Roosevelt writes, "The drive down to Charlottesville." So again, she's just coming and going in her roadster between Washington and Charlottesville. The drive yesterday was very lovely. The trees have begun to put out their brilliant colors down there, but when we stood on the little lawn in front of Franklin and Ethel's house, it felt more like a summer day. The baby behaved beautifully. No tears and a most friendly spirit. Of course, I know that a healthy baby is usually a placid one, but it certainly is a pleasure to find a welcoming smile, even when you know that at the age of 12 weeks, no real intention may lie back of it. So those of you who are parents and grandparents will understand what she meant by that. Now, another amazing visit by the Roosevelts back in Charlottesville. This is in June of 1940. June 10th, 1940 is when graduation from the university was held, and after 3 years, Franklin Jr. graduated from the law school. According to Mrs. Roosevelt in her Next Days, My Day column, she says, "The president, his aides, and I left Washington yesterday at 2 o'clock for Charlottesville, Virginia. On the way down, he went over his speech," meaning the president did, "and I could well understand his desire to weigh each word, for I do believe the time has come to speak out as to where we stand. Unless we do, there can be no moral unity and no spiritual preparation for the conflict of ideas." What's happening in Europe now? This day, sadly, the Italians declared war on the French and the British, and they invaded France. So, as this is being written down in his own handwriting on the train down by the president, he says, up to this point, in doing so, that is the promises that have been made, he says, by Germany in doing so, it has manifested disregard for the rights and security of other nations, for the lives of the peoples of those nations, which are directly, theoretically, by the spread of the war. They are threatened by the spread of war, and has evidence its willingness to find this fact that they're just simply not engaging in any kind of honest way with any of the treaties that had been made prior to this time. And so then he writes in, on this 10th day of June, "The hand that held the dagger," meaning the Italians, "has struck it into the back of their neighbors," meaning the Italians have invaded. So, Eleanor is pleased that the president is now moving beyond his feeling that he had to be neutral and is now going to step up for the American people. And then she goes on to say that she was really pleased to be met by Ethel at the Charlottesville train station, and that Ethel seemed to be doing better after having that fall from her horse. She said that, and it's, by the way, they're sitting on the porch of their home somewhere outside of Charlottesville, Franklin Jr. and Ethel, and she said she thought Franklin Jr. looked a little tired from all his studying for his exams, and she said, and now he's got the New York bar exam, then he starts his job, and she said, you know, education never really ends in our lives. The other thing that brought the Roosevelts here was Pa Watson and his wife, Frances, and that they had built this estate, Kenwood, just beyond Monticello. And they even built, in addition to the main house, they built a cottage for the president with no steps. But from what I've read, he preferred to stay in the main house where everybody else was, because he was so gregarious and known for making cocktails every afternoon and inviting everybody to join them. Pa Watson sadly died of a heart attack on the way back from Yalta. So he had accompanied the president to Yalta in 1945 and died on the ship on the way back, and Roosevelt would be gone 2 months later. But Mrs. Watson, who was a concert pianist, lived, we think, at Kenwood, I think all the way till she died in the early 70s. She then donated the property and the improvements to the university, and you know that's part of the Jefferson Library now there. And I also discovered that she donated all of her papers and her husband's papers to the university. So again, thank you to Punky and everyone who has helped me to get to this topic, because I think there's more to tell. Just a quick couple of last slides. I'm getting my high five from Punky, and I will finish up. And that is that in 1939, you will see on the two sides at the top, the president, again, holding on tight, but he's laying the cornerstone of the Jefferson Memorial. He was a staunch supporter of Jefferson and his theories of democracy and equality. And then in 1943, on the president's birthday, that is Jefferson's birthday, April 13th, you can see him holding tight, getting ready to speak to the crowds, and there's a band in front of him. He says, today in the midst of the great war for freedom, now we're right in the thick of World War II, we dedicate a shrine to freedom, to Thomas Jefferson, apostle of freedom. We are paying a debt long overdue. The words which we have chosen for this memorial speak Jefferson's noblest and most urgent meaning. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Again, things seem to come around and be even more meaningful today. Lastly, I discovered that, I actually told George this, have you all, do you still watch the Waltons? Remember that? I'm totally overtaken on the Waltons. I started watching that show in high school. It's now on Hallmark Channel. It's based on the true life of Earl Hamner and his family who lived up in Schuyler, and their crises during the Great Depression and World War II. And in one of their episodes, before I even knew I was going to be doing this topic, they did a whole episode about President Roosevelt dying. And in the show, the family says, we're going to Charlottesville, and we're going to pay tribute to the president when he comes through the station in the coffin that has been brought on this train from Warm Springs, where he died in April of 1945. So first of all, the staying bidding farewell by Mr. Graham Jackson, who used to play his accordion for President at Warm Springs in the White House. And here he's sobbing with tears to say goodbye to his friend, and he's playing Going Home. And the picture at the top right are of Charlottesvillians waiting for the train to pass through Charlottesville, and this is what they would have seen, the two military men standing at alert. So with that, I say time for questions and comments.
So thank you, Barbara. We have such a large crowd tonight. Sandra Thomas is going to be the monitor. And raise your hand if you have a question, and Sarah will take the questions on that side, and I'll do this side. So Sandra.
Okay, so questions? Questions, comments? Again, some of you came up to me beforehand and said you knew of other stories, so please.
I'll start.
Wow, good for you. And we have a hand over here. Great, go.
Unusual starter.
Great.
I grew up in Oyster Bay. Loved Teddy's Sagamore Hill. It escapes me why this family that was so prominent in New England sent their progeny to UVA. I know, I'm sorry, that UVA was considered the Ivy League of the South, but I mean, honestly.
And we like to think of Harvard as the UVA of the North.
Touche,
You just put that right over the plate, and I had to
I'll go right back to your girlfriend.
Oh, throwing shade.
Why did they come to UVA?
Well, I would say-
I love the idea that they came to
Yes.
UVA. Please give
But
us a little background.
Franklin Sr. went undergrad to Harvard and to the Harvard Law School. So I would say it's probably similar to the Kennedys. Again, New England, Massachusetts, New York, Harvard for undergrad, and then for Teddy and Bobby here to law school.
They came here.
They came here. I don't know this for sure, but I would guess that in all three of these cases, they couldn't get into Harvard.
Barbara, we have a question. I want you to brace yourself for this. Professor Andrew O'Shaughnessy is here.
Hiding. Oh, thank you for hiding so I didn't get nervous this evening.
Thank you for an excellent summary of his visits. As you know, I worked for 20 years at Kenwood,
I do know
Carl
that.
Watson's home,
Yes.
and it contained a visitor book given by Franklin Roosevelt to Carl Watson,
Yes.
which showed that he was at Kenwood for 4 days leading up to D-Day. And,
I had read that, indeed.
and wrote the D-Day prayer
At Paul Watson's.
That's right,
Yeah.
which he gave on D-Day,
Yeah.
on the radio. I was never able to discover, and I'm just curious if you might have any ideas, why he would come to Virginia, why he would go to Kenwood when such a massive operation was occurring. My one assumption was that it was part of the feint that the British were using as well to pretend nothing special was going to happen.
That sounds like a good possibility to me. The other is, if indeed you knew what was coming, and in those days didn't think you had to be in Washington because you didn't need to be in a situation room. You could easily get the word from the sit room, and you are staying with your #1 military aide, Pa Watson. Why not get out to try to relax as best you can in the beautiful bucolic countryside of Central Virginia? But I like your thought as a historian. I'm a political scientist, a mere political scientist. But I like the idea that maybe it was part of the head fake to say, yeah, oh yeah, the president's down in Virginia. He must be spending a relaxing weekend or week with Pa Watson and to put off, obviously they did put off the Germans in a host of ways, including the so-called the man who never was, the Operation Mincemeat, to make it look as though they were going to invade from the south and the soft underbelly of France and Europe. But thank you for that. And then again, I had come across that, but since we were focusing a little bit more on Farmington, I thought I don't have quite enough time to go into that. But as I was saying to some of you ahead of time, this was all new to me. And again, thanks to George for coming up with so much of the research, and then I just took off from there. But it's so exciting and interesting. I think there might be a book here.
Yes.
What do you all think? Let's see, we have someone here. Sarah, can you hold on? Wait for the mic. There you go. Stand up.
I was waiting for you to mention Stephen Early.
Speak into the microphone.
Stephen Early, his longtime press secretary,
Well,
was
and-
from here.
Well, yes, and this is why this is really good when you start a project and you start down a road as a scholar. There's no way you can know everything. And again, my colleagues, Punky and George and Melissa, were saying, can you talk about coming to Farmington? So I began with that, and only when you came up to me ahead of time today to say, so Rosalie was saying, I discovered in my dad's papers just recently, and tell them who your dad is if they don't know.
My father.
Rosalie, put the mic right up to your mouth.
Okay, Donald Stevens, he was the one who put Farmington together. All the investors would buy Farmington to turn it into a country club. But
So one thing I want to know from you, and I hope you will, I'll give you my card, I hope we'll keep in touch, and that is your dad's connection with Stephen Early. Stephen Early was the press secretary for FDR, and the thing that you told me that I for sure didn't know was that he was born in Crozet.
he was born in Crozet, and we have a village, I guess, Earlysville, which is right west of the airport.
So that family name is, oh my goodness. Well, it was Steve Early, I believe, who called Mrs. Roosevelt that fateful April day, 1945, when she was having lunch at the Sulgrave Club in Washington, and just very quickly said, Mrs. Roosevelt, you need to come back to the White House. And she said in her 3-volume memoir, I knew what had happened. Even though she had just talked to the president a night or two before, who had gone for, as he'd like to go in the spring, to Warm Springs. She had just talked to him, and he sounded upbeat, more rested from all of the burdens of World War II. And so she thought maybe he's going to be doing better. And yet she said, I just knew in my heart, it just sank. And I got in my car and I drove back to the White House. What she says, though, in her memoir is, and think about this as relation to the news that came out this past Sunday about former President Biden, and people saying, why didn't the First Lady demand the PSA test, or didn't they, what did they know, and when did they know it? What did they see? Didn't they see he was declining? And Mrs. Roosevelt said about FDR, who looked like death in those last months, and he was suffering from congestive heart failure and would die of a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs. She said, even though I knew what had happened, I couldn't believe it. Because she said, he just was larger than life. I couldn't imagine a world without him. And she's thinking of that personally, I'm sure, but she's also thinking about what is the world going to do without him? And particularly since it's Harry Truman who's stepping up to the presidency, and while people now look back at Harry Truman and think, oh, what a great plain-speaking president he was, that people didn't know very much about him at all at that time, and he left office in 1953 with approval ratings in the 20s, about like Nixon would in the 1970s. So I think she was also reporting how she felt for the world. And he missed the end of the war in Europe by a month. May 8th, we just celebrated the 80th anniversary of VE Day. And of course, he would miss the end of the war in Japan. So thank you, Rosalie. And others of you who have these stories, please let me know.
Thank you, Barbara. I wish we had more time for questions, but we don't. But we do.
She is the teacher, always. Class is over.
Wait a minute, Sally is correcting me. How many minutes? I have 3 minutes, well, I have to give her the gift. Yeah. All right. So, Barbara, fitting with your expertise,
Yes.
this is a handmade bowl from Montpelier, made from a cedar of Lebanon at Montpelier, and a cherry tree from Montpelier.
Go to historic homes or come to a place like this and with this historical society and think of these pictures. And I just have done this since my parents took me to Hodgenville, Kentucky when I was about 6 to see Lincoln's birthplace. And they said, this tree here on this property was here when he was born. And I know other girls of my generation would have said this about the Beatles. I'm breathing their air. But that's how I feel about historical societies and homes and clubs like this that have us remember. And so this will be especially meaningful.
Well, you and James have a ball with that bowl.